Hi everyone, and welcome to the Newsagent podcast. I'm Susie Lysett, Senior Content Executive at Goodlord, and this episode is a recording of our Q&A on the topic of the Renters Reform Bill. Now that the Queen's speech has put it back on the agenda, the industry has a lot of questions, and Sean Hooker, Head of Redress at the Property Redress Scheme, and Goodlord's Sherlock, joined this session to try to answer at least some of them. As well as answering audience questions, they talked through what's been proposed so far, potential timelines on when we may see the Renters Reform Bill white paper with more details, as well as predictions for when the proposals themselves may come into play. So, without any further ado, on with the podcast.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this instalment of Goodlord's webinar series. Today, we're joined by Sean Hooker, Head of Redress at the Property Redress Scheme. And we're going to be discussing the Renters Reform Bill, which has come back to front and centre following the Queen's speech. The Q&A is on throughout the session, so please do post your questions. And we'll cover those as we go along. And if we can't sort of weave them into the conversation, we'll be dealing with them all at the final stage of today's webinar. For those of you joining us today who haven't heard of Goodlord, Goodlord are a pre-tenancy process that help streamline the entire pre-tenancy flow and indeed deliver revenue benefits throughout that journey as well, allowing you to spend time focusing on growing your business in the way that you want to, rather than being held up by administration or processes. To understand more about what we do, please visit our website at goodlord.co. That hopefully is as much of a Goodlord pitch as you're going to get today. For those who join us regularly, it's not really about Goodlord, these sessions. It's about trying to get guests on who can give us some insights to what's happening in a market that is ever changing. And indeed a world that's ever changing, which has direct implications on to us as businesses and letting agents within the sector. So without further ado, let's bring on Sean. Good morning, Sean. How are you?
Good morning, Ollie. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Indeed, it's a busy one, Sean. It's clear that the Renters Reform Bill is a hot topic and clearly should be as well. For those who are maybe not as au fait with Mr. Sean Hooker, albeit that if you're on LinkedIn, there's no doubt you are, because your activity on there is unbelievable. Can you just give them a quick sort of summary of who you are, Sean, and what you do?
Yes, certainly, Ollie. Yes, my name is Sean Hooker. I am Head of Redress at the Property Redress Scheme, which is one of the two government-authorised redress schemes that all property agents should be members of. I joined an organisation called Hamilton Fraser 15 years ago. I was involved in tenancy deposits for a good number of years before moving on to this redress for agents. Ongoing, we've launched some mediation service through our Property Redress Scheme service, and we are trialling a landlord redress scheme, which we'll find out a little bit more about later, as a pilot with the National Residential Landlords Association.
Fantastic. Well, it's very good to have you here today, Sean. We've spoken at length about many different topics over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, and these sessions always seem to get agents sort of interacting and questions coming in. To that point, we've already had 4 questions. So, and you'll be pleased to know they're not just about you, Sean. There's 2 questions of the same ilk here. One from Andrew. Good morning, Andrew, and another one of somebody who didn't leave their name regarding a legal cover policy. Will Goodlord be creating one? Indeed, we have. And if you want to reach out to us for more information on that, then please do. We can talk you through what that looks like, how it's going to work, how it does work, and indeed the benefits are to that level of service. But please do reach out to us following this webinar, and we can go through those steps. 2 questions there at the same ilk. Clearly aligned thinking. But back to today's sort of talking point around the Renters Reform Bill. We're going to talk through the latest updates. A couple of weeks ago, the Queen's speech took place with Prince Charles stepping in instead of the Queen, and the Renters Reform Bill was put back in the front and centre view, albeit only a few lines. Those few lines were quite meaningful in terms of acknowledging that this thing was rolling forward. And we've kind of been here before, haven't we, Sean, in terms of thinking it's just on the edge, just about to drop, and of course other things have taken priority. notably the pandemic, which is arguably fair. So we're going to talk through the latest updates. We're going to try and give you approximate timelines on what we're hearing. We've got Sean, who, from PRS perspective, is hopefully hearing some rumblings that he can share with us. I myself am a member of the Lettings Industry Council. I think Sean, some of your colleagues are too. And the paper that we've created through the Lettings Industry Council comes out this week or next, I think, in regards to Renters Reform Bill. So we'll try and share some approximate timelines and sort of where we are in the process. And as I said earlier, the live Q&A is on throughout today's session. So if you've got a pertinent question, chuck it on there. In fact, if you've got any question, chuck it on there. Even if it is about Sean's experience or what he likes to do at the weekends, I will answer it. So let's get into it. Let's look at the latest updates then in regards to the Renters Reform Bill. Sean, as I said, the Queen's speech brought this back into focus. What does it tell us? Where are we up to at the moment?
Well, first of all, yes, well done to the government for actually putting it into the Queen's speech, because there was talk that they were not going to include it specifically as part of the announcement. And when I mean the announcement, Prince Charles read out the 20-minute summary, which contained one line, and then there's a briefing paper in the back. And the logic was that they'd already announced that they were committed to do it. Why did they need to reassert it? I'm glad they did, because we've learned a little bit if you read in between the lines. I particularly like the fact that they have said, it's as part of their preamble on that, they want to ensure a more effective legal framework and a stable rental market for landlords to invest in. And that's maybe a slight change of tone from what people have been thinking the government has actually been saying, which is basically about tenant focus and tackling on the rogues, etc., etc. This appears to be that they're looking for a longer-term solution that is going to encompass the whole of the sector and engage in it. Words are cheap, though.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. It's a point I actually made with our mutual friend Paul Chaplin a week or two ago, and the view that I hold is that we've been kind of distracted by the Section 21 part of this, and potentially are not looking at the holistic piece of work they're looking to deliver. And the reason I mention it is because I think and I said this on the last webinar, I think we've got to hold them accountable here, because the words are important, actions are more important. But actually, when you look at the detail, what has been suggested from the very start actually is providing landlords with more powers if the tenant is not adhering to that contract. And actually, the latest piece of wording that you've just gone through there in terms of investment feels like a bit of a change in tone. And maybe the government are recognising that the pressure on landlords is such that actually it needs some external help here. We can't just continue to sort of bash them with, heavy legislation and ultimately put them in a position whereby being a landlord isn't workable anymore. So do you expect now, because of that slight tonal change, to see and be delivered a more holistic bill that actually offers benefits to both tenants and landlords? Or is your suspicion that maybe it's a bit smoke and mirrors and we might just end up back focusing on Section 21?
Well, look, the political pressure to abolish Section 21, is ramping up. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But the reality is that you've got to have something that works. We know that there are 4.4 million households in the country that rely on rental, the private rented sector. We know the government, again, due to other factors possibly, but they've woefully under-delivered on their house building program. So we have a housing shortage. We have a standard of living crisis. We have energy issues and price rises on that. So the government is under an awful lot of pressure. It needs to deliver. It will be going to an election eventually, probably 2024. It has to have an agenda that's going to mean that they can keep that tenant vote, but they are not undermining the vital work that the private rented sector does in providing a housing solution in the country. So yes, let's hope it is a change of tone.
So in terms of the focuses then, we're going to come on to approximate timelines and discuss the different elements of this. But what do you think we'll end up with at the end of this process on the basis of all the information that you know now? Because at the start of this, there were numerous almost manifesto points that were looking to be achieved. And we're going to talk through shortly of some of the ones that actually have maybe dropped off. But what's your expectation on what we know now in terms of this bill, what this bill's going to deliver?
Well, I think what it's going to deliver, it will get rid of Section 21 in name and in substance, I would say, Ollie. The reality is that we know that the Section 21 processes have changed dramatically since they were introduced over 20 years ago now. They have. But from the get-go, they were always slightly flawed in the sense that it was a no-fault eviction, but people used it when they wanted to get a quicker result than pointing a finger. And I think one of the things that's going to be the challenge is how do you change that to a new system of giving a reason, albeit that reason will include things like house moving or moving back into the property and education and student type lets. How do you have that without it actually becoming cumbersome and a burden on the court system and on the time of both tenants and landlords? So that's the first challenge of that. They definitely are looking at a register. They definitely are looking at a register. They don't want to call it a register. It's a typical kind of thing of politicians. They don't want to call things what they are. But basically, it's effectively going to be a register. But it's going to be based on decent home standards. These are the standards that have been in place since about 2006, I believe. They're trying to apply it. Well, they've applied to the social sector, but they want to apply it and review it so that it applies more appropriately to the private rented sector. So that's another big part of it. And redress, alternative dispute resolution, whatever you want to call it. They want to earlier intervention. They want things to be sorted out without going to the expense of court, or ultimately to enforcement, because those things cost an awful lot of money. Alternative dispute resolution can effectively deliver a cost-effective and way of dealing with things, much cheaper, much quicker than the court process or going through enforcement.
And just two questions, actually. One's coming first. Nicola was asked if this is recorded, this session, and can be viewed again. Yes, it is, Nicola. And we have the, I think, mutual friend, Mr. Eric Walker. Good morning, Eric. Asking a pertinent question, actually, to the point you've just made there, Sean. Why is a new landlord ombudsman being mooted when there are two perfectly capable redress schemes already? We run the risk of maybe overstepping here into the next slide, but I think given the fact you just mentioned the, I mean, that's how this works, right? I don't think we've done one of these where we've actually followed the slide, so we're directed by the viewers here mostly. Yeah, fair question from Eric. There's a framework there that, ultimately, arguably works at the moment. Why is this new phase of process being sort of mooted?
Well, I think it is. Eric, brilliant, insightful question as usual. The reality is that the government has been influenced by a lot of work done by the academic ADR world in terms of research and other things that they believe that the consumer is confused if they have to make a choice over alternative dispute resolution. So this is what I call the one ring to rule them all kind of philosophy on ombudsman, which is there should be a single ombudsman that represents a single sector. There's some compelling reasons why that is a good approach, but there are a lot of reasons why it's not. And Eric has put his finger on it. Why throw out the baby with the bathwater? Why break something when it works? And that's why I think they've used the word portal, and I think they've used the word gateway in the language that they're using. They want a single entry point. They want a single focus. That doesn't necessarily mean what goes on behind the scenes means that there's going to be a single overarching or new body that's going to need to be set up. Remember, government doesn't like running things. It costs them money. So they tend to go out and they tender it. And we know that if you tender something out and you give it to a single supplier, there are drawbacks for that, inefficiencies and other things that a single point of failure, I call it. So I'm working with them just to see if we can get the best of both worlds on that. I think it's important that we have and build on what we've got, but we do improve it, and the access to it is improved. So good question, Eric.
And in terms of the, we've got a question asking a register of what. Can you just clarify for viewers who maybe not as au fait with what the potential changes here, what the suggestion is around the register process?
Well, it's evolved because the government spent some money and got some consultants in. But they always although I haven't actually seen the actual conclusions of what they concluded when I've been speaking to government, the emphasis has changed slightly from registering the individual or the person, namely the landlord, to looking at it being driven by the property and the property condition. Now, there's a lot of advantages of that. Properties don't move; they stay where they are. They are what they are. So it doesn't matter if you change ownership or management of it; the property is still going to be there. And if you focus on a condition, and this is why they're pushing these decent home standards, you can actually the register will be on the property, and it will stay on there regardless of whether the landlord is renting it out or not. So that's, I think, the emphasis of what they're doing there. The wording they kind of like using is to allow the tenants to challenge a landlord over the condition of that property. So the register will be more than just a list. Okay.
And in terms of the redress schemes running behind what we think is going to be a sort of single point of control that then layers into these different firms, is this viewed as a profitable process, David asks, or is it a non-for-profit process? And he asks if it is profitable, what happens with the profits there as a result of these processes?
Well, that's a very good question. And the reality is that whatever scheme I think will be run, it will be free. The ADR part of it will be free to use. Of course, nothing comes for nothing. And it's quite a skilled job to mediate or to arbitrate on these issues. We spend a lot of money on getting skilled and talented people in that know what they're doing. We don't want this to be a tick box exercise. We don't want this to be a meaningless way of dealing with what is very, very important issues. So yes, there is going to be a cost. Now, whether that cost comes through a registration fee or whether it comes through paying for the industry pays for the individual complaints to be handled, all I can say is that we are looking at a very big sector. We are looking at 2.5 million landlords out there, adding to the 30 or 40,000 agents that are already out in the market. Spreading the costs over that sort of numbers, you can push the costs right down, because most people will not have complaints that will need to be referred up. They are relatively rare. Around about 5% of our members actually have complaints on not even on a regular basis. It's two or three a year would be exceptional to come in front of my desk from any particular agent. Again, it all depends on the size of the agent. If you spread those costs over, you can deliver a cost-effective system. And now, if you think of that and compare what the cost of courts are, then we are talking a completely different league here. But of course, there will be a surplus. Schemes will need a surplus. You're going to run it for not-for-profit, but if you're going to run it effectively, if the surplus is in there, it will be reinvested back into delivering better services.
Yeah. And there's two questions here, one from Chris, one from somebody who hasn't left the name, both of a similar sort of tone in terms of, how do we convince new landlords to let their property and not sell? They feel shafted, says Chris. Another question from somebody who's not left the name. Landlords are very concerned that they won't be able to get tenants out in the future. We don't have anything to give them comfort, so there is likely to be even less property to rent. And I think on these points, I think it's important to remember what the bill is representing at the moment. The bill is not representing, at the moment, we're going to make it more difficult for you to get your property back when you need to. That isn't what they're saying. Now, it might be how we feel it could go, but that isn't what they're saying. And actually, I think the latest tonal change does support a more holistic view between landlords and tenants, it's fair to say, Sean. But I understand this. I understand this concern because landlords have been through, a really tough time. And arguably from a government's perspective, during the pandemic, landlords were left to carry the can, really, in a lot of respects. You've got to work with your tenants. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. And actually they did. And, the kind of sentiment towards landlords seems to not being improving. And if you're a landlord set there at a moment with rising costs yourself, remember most landlords aren't, billionaires driving around in Bentleys. They're single or two property owners looking to just get a return on their small investment. It's understandable that they feel, shafted is the word Chris has used, but they feel pressure. What should letting agents be doing at this stage to sort of give some comfort? And is it worth pointing out that actually the reform bill itself does note about giving landlords more powers and quicker and more effective powers where there's a breach like arrears, for example?
Well, absolutely. And what people don't realise, and again, I speak to Paul on a regular basis, Paul Champolina, and he points out and say, well, actually, it's always been framed as that there's the landlord and the tenant is the victim and the landlord is the perpetrator. It's not, no way. That's no way a reflection of the truth. Most landlords are small operators. They only own a couple of properties. Their margins are tight. They're doing it for reasons of pensions and a bit of extra income. So they're not kind of like the big corporations that you can sometimes imagine. The government kind of sees the sector. The reality is that also that a bad tenant can also affect good tenants. The number of properties are in HMO, for example, the number of stories that we see on a regular basis of one bad apple in an HMO upsetting, their fellow housemates and causing absolute distress and inconvenience. Those people should not be protected and kept in a property because it's the tenants that are actually suffering as well as the landlord. So it's a complex picture, and we need to put that into perspective.
And that actually points towards Rachel's question. Good morning, Rachel. What about a bad tenant register? Now, this has been bandied about for some time, and I think feels like one isn't on the agenda, but two, relatively hard to manage and control.
Right. Okay. So here's where you have to start to look cleverly. Actually, in effect, getting rid of a no-fault system and introducing a fault system could mean that effectively you could look at getting some form of at least credit reference register up against tenants. The number of people that use Section 21 as a convenient way to get the property back when they're in arrears, they've looked at their tenant, the tenant hasn't got any money, so why go through a whole hassle of going to court and getting a money order and everything else there? Go to Section 21, get vacant possession, get the tenant out, and it's somebody else's problem.
Move on. Move
on. Now, effectively, now you've got a fault-based system or a reason-based system. Let's call it a reason, not a fault. Then you will be putting down rent arrears. And there's two implications on that, okay? Very quickly. If you do that, then you should get a money order, because that will at least put that tenant onto a bad footing on the credit referencing, and make it difficult for them to move on. It also helps your fellow landlord, of course, know that the tenant is not a good tenant. I know a lot of landlords are reluctant to kind of give bad referencing to tenants. Maybe they feel intimidated by the tenant, but if it's on the register, or a credit register, then it's not easy for the tenant to escape that. And this is another big point as well that, I'm going to be very interested to see how they address it. At the moment, if you present yourself to the local authority after being served a Section 21 eviction notice, you are homeless and they have a legal right to try and house you. If you make yourself intentionally homeless, they have no legal obligation to do that.
Yeah.
So effectively, if you have got, you're evicted because you've been antisocial or you've not paid your rent, what obligation does the local authority have to house you?
But this feels like a miss. We're going to come on to the third point shortly around shelter and friends. I mean, you're applying pressure on one part, but actually it then essentially scuppers the people you're essentially trying to help in another stage of the process. So it has to be thought through, and any challenge to this process or change to this process has to be thought through. And I take your point on the Section 21 versus, say, Section 8 and then money order. But the reality is, unless the legal process is expedited and streamlined, there's still problems there. The amount of time, and I appreciate we're coming on the back of a pandemic, I get that. But even pre-pandemic, you're looking at 4 or 5 months. The amount of time it takes to get somebody out of a property when there's clear cause to do so, I feel that has to be evaluated as part of this. And what I'm hoping is the powers that are given to landlords as part of the Renters Reform Bill, where they've noted that if in situations like arrears, for example, you can get your property back quicker. I really hope they deliver that both in wording but also in process, because if they don't, I struggle to see how the court's going to keep up. We've not seen mass change in the courts for some time.
Well, that's wherein the joined up thinking needs to come in, and the work that we've been doing for the Letting Industry Council with that paper. I'm really looking forward to seeing the whole of that, because I worked on the redress part of it in the register, and you've worked on other bits. And I know previews are going out there at the moment, so I'm looking forward to looking at that in detail, because it will probably be knowing the people on the Letting Industry Council a holistic view, whereas this seems a little bit disjointed. And the joined up thinking is that when it comes to things like arrears and possessions or arrears or even repair issues, the earlier you intervene in these things, the better. So the redress schemes will be a vital link to this, but it needs to start a lot earlier than the process is at the moment. So one of the things I really want to see is that there is a lot of directive to landlords early days to actually engage with their tenants and to engage with redress, because if you get mediation or redress involved at that earlier stage, when the arrears are not so severe, when the problems are less protracted, then there is a much higher prospect of getting a satisfactory result. So that needs to be hardwired into the process. And I'm getting, from what I've been talking in the background, I'm getting the feeling that's the kind of thinking that they are looking at.
We'll be right back after this message.
Are you always worrying about compliance at your agency and just want it off your plate? Well, that's one of the things Goodlord's here to help you with. From sending the How to Rent guide and attaching property certificates, to taking the right deposit amounts and sending prescribed information, we'll help you take care of lettings compliance all in one place. Head to goodlord.co to check compliance off your to-do list. Goodlord. It's just that good.
In terms of, we've got a double down question from the previous point. Somebody hasn't left the name. They ask, I don't feel that the question has been answered about how to ensure our landlords don't feel, in inverted commas, shafted. HMOs is a tiny part of why tenants shouldn't be held liable. What quick answer can we give landlords to ensure they don't feel this is a bad thing for them? I would revert you back to the point that was made within, I think, one of the first couple of statements when this was announced, around giving landlords more powers in the event of things like arrears, for example. Unfortunately, we're still dealing in hypotheticals. And when Sean and I sort of met to sort of discuss this session today, it's pretty frustrating that we're not a huge amount of time, a huge amount of detail forward, but we're a lot of time forward compared to our last conversation around this. So I think it's important to note that we're still waiting, as is the rest of the industry, on clarification. But I would be suggesting to landlords that the Renters Reform Bill, we're hoping presents an opportunity to give you the ability to get your property back quicker than you could do at the moment, albeit the device in which you're able to get it back is going to change. I think that's the only thing I think we can point towards at the moment, Sean, with any real consistency, without knowing the detail in which the bill is going to be delivered.
No, absolutely. And, feelings are running high at the moment because of the uncertainty. And also what's happened in the past, because we know that the government listens to people like Shelter and Generation Rent. Why wouldn't they, when there are far more tenants out there than there are landlords, and politicians like votes? So there has been an agenda where the landlord has been seen as the pariah, B, a cash cow, dare I say it. Certainly, when you look at the tax regime now, it is not as attractive from a tax point of view to go into property as it was. What's compensated for that is, of course, we are looking at record high rents at the moment. We are looking at property prices increasing. Demand is far outstrips the supply. So at the moment, I would say a lot of landlords are enjoying good returns on their investments. I know costs are going up, and I know what the government is proposing on things like energy efficiency is going to put a lot of burden on landlords in the future, but it's still a very attractive industry to come into. If you look at our annual report last year, we grew our membership of letting agents coming into the sector.
Yeah.
Overall, if you look at the deposit schemes, more landlords are coming into the sector. Some of these are different to the old school landlords, younger, different ideas, different models to actually to operate. So it's a constantly adapting and evolving industry.
And that for me is exactly why agents exist and where they sit in the middle of these challenges. And if you're letting agent at the moment, you do feel brunt of this. So I understand the tone of the questions in terms of feeling frustrated, landlords feeling like they're up against it. But I think the opportunity that these changes present, hopefully, shines a light on the value that letting agents bring. I'm a big believer in letting agencies, and you can argue I have a commercial interest because we work for Goodlord and we work letting agencies. It really isn't that simple, because actually this is a convoluted process, and this process is only going to get more convoluted, and that's where property professionals are desperately needed. And, we've talked about this stat before, but, one of the reports, I think it was you guys actually at Hamilton Fraser, around 65 or 60% 65, I think it was, percent of landlords don't use a letting agency service. The focus, I think should be on how do we educate those 65%, because ultimately you don't want to be doing this on your own. Unless this is your full-time job and you've got, a massive property that is fulfilling an income that you can live off. These processes are going to be tricky, and they're going to bring with them, penalties that landlords simply will not want to risk. And that's exactly where letting agents can come in. So, trying to turn this challenge into a positive thing, I think then centralizes around education. And of course, one of the things that, we at Goodlord are frustrated about, our founder, Tom Mundy, came out only a few weeks ago and voiced this across the media. We really need transparency on a lot of these moving points within the bill to be able to start to give some clarity and build businesses up from an education point of view. But every challenge does have its opportunity, doesn't it? Now, that opportunity is somewhat being further challenged by Shelter and Friends. We've got it noted on the slide here. We saw a pretty ridiculous marketing campaign come out about 3 or 4 weeks ago, which I think, again, I mentioned on a previous webinar, frustrated me really, because I think it showed clearly how little Shelter actually understand what agents do. And I'm not sure it's that clever to alienate the one body of professionals that have that are a conduit between all the parties and ridicule them. But this challenge is relatively serious, isn't it? Because they have clear intent on what they want. How do you see this playing out over time from a Shelter and similar organisations' perspective? Who seems to be winning that battle, as it were?
Well, that's a very good question, Ollie. When look, we all love our statistics in this business, and there are a lot of statistics. Whether they actually all make sense is another matter, and that's one of the things that is quite frustrating when you see the way that Celtic manipulates some of the statistics. Effectively, we know we're coming out of a pandemic. We know we had a moratorium and an eviction ban. We know that a lot of tenants that were not paying rent were allowed to stay in their properties. The courts are now catching up. Of course, you're going to see increases in court activity in terms of evictions and possessions. But that will stabilise out. The reality is that most landlords kept their tenants in situ and protected them from the worst of the pandemic effects. There was help and support from the government. Whether it was enough or not, I don't know. And we know that the current pressures of a cost of living and a energy crisis are going to start to hit. However, I don't find it helpful that you have this them and us attitude. Most tenants want to rent and have a decent home and a place to call home. Most landlords want a nice, well-behaved tenant that pays their rent regularly. If you get that equation with a good letting agent to manage it, the golden triangle, as I call it, everybody is happy. Why is it seen, as an infliction renting on tenants? Yes, of course, there are the vulnerable side of it. There are people that are living in poor quality accommodation that needs to be dealt with. But most people have a good relationship.
Nobody's disputing that, and that's a frustration.
Yeah.
99% of letting agents, they want all of those things to line up. Why? Because their life is easier.
Yeah,
it's far easier. The landlord wants that because they get their rent paid. They have to invest less. And the tenant wants that because they stay in their property longer. And tenure is growing. And I think we're fast approaching the necessity to have the conversation around the meaningfulness of the PRS within this country, because it still feels like renting is secondary to home owning. The government have been very clear in their push to want people to buy their own homes, but just wanting that and actually delivering that are two really different things. And home building, house building is not moving at the pace it needs to, which in my mind means that for the next decade, if not more, we're going to be in similar positions where actually tenant demand is ever growing. So, the idea that we're leading off the lowest common denominator of less than 1%, and I don't buy Shelter's figures on the amount of properties that are inhabitable. I think that I just don't know where they come from. That isn't my experience in over a decade in this industry, and I'm sure it's not yours or our agent's experience. But it's a strange one, and we've had a question in asking what marketing campaign was. The marketing campaign essentially was a well produced, it must be said. It looked like it cost a bit of money. That video essentially ridiculing the role in which letting agents play, and suggesting that agents don't really care, and they don't really care about the properties, they don't really care about the tenants. They're just there to fling them in without any kind of concern thereafter, and that clearly isn't true. I mean, it's worth keeping an eye, I think, on this, and my personal view is that all these groups work together. I'm not against what shelters stand for per se. We all want tenants to have the best possible living conditions they can, and a fair process. I'm not sure their direction in drawing those battle lines has been conducive to a conversation around, though, and I fear that those two sides, as you put it, have now been drawn, unfortunately, Sean. But time will tell, I suppose. I'm conscious of time. We also mentioned Roper here. We actually did, I think, 2 sessions on Roper, and we talked through then what was coming down the tracks, because that looked like that train was well on its way. We were hearing behind the scenes there was more and more work dedicated to Roper. It's gone quiet. Where are we from a Roper perspective, and what do you think is going to happen?
Okay, right. So, absolutely, if when I first kind of saw the agenda that was coming out there, I kind of, in my mind, I thought, well, actually, if you regulate the property agents, that's your starting point, because then you have got, who they are. You have a set of code that you would measure them by, and you would expect them to have a certain amount of qualification or competence to actually do the job. So I always thought that ROPA would be a priority rather than an afterthought. It appears to be now a bit of an afterthought, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Okay, one of them is not least the Grenfell and the leasehold side of it. Majority of property managers are in that sector, not in the private rented sector. Property management is a skill, a hugely important skill for building maintenance and building safety. Now that applies across both leasehold and the private rented sector, but it's a lot more complex after the health and the fire safety stuff that we've actually had to deal with. And I think they're kind of parking that until they can get a solution on how to deal with the property management of buildings per se, which is why I think they're now looking at decent homes and other stuff rather than at the regulation of property agents. Secondly, is that I think that they also want to buy themselves some time on this. So there's been two announcements I've heard. One was at the IRPM conference where Lord Greenhalgh, who is the Lord spokesman, said that they are still considering ROPA and they will respond to ROPA. And also Eddie Hughes said it in a parliamentary question that it's still on the agenda. They're not just setting a timeline on it.
And I think your point around the sequence is a really good one. I like you would have thought that would be a good starting point to then bring everything aligned. The biggest question mark, I suppose, for me is how the government and the legislative points view landlords and agents, and making sure that view is aligned. Because, from a property professional's perspective, we should ideally want people to be served by professionals. And if it's easier to be a landlord on your own, and it's cheaper to be a landlord on your own rather than go through an agent because of the amount of things they have to do as an agent, then that creates a real problem in my mind. So it'd be interesting to see how they layer ROPA out and what the knock-on effect to landlords is. But I think we've said before in previous sessions, we felt ROPA was something that could help the industry step up and actually show that we have the experience and the education points that indeed the industry already does. So it'd be interesting to see how and when it's back on the agenda. But my guess is from what you said there, we probably shouldn't hold our breath for too long. It's going to be a while yet, because the focus is indeed going to be the bill itself as a priority.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to have to work out what they want to measure first before they start, doing that. And surprisingly, after all these years, they don't know exactly what they want to measure. That's the issue that we've got at the moment.
And you mentioned the decent homes standard there. So if we can just go on to the next slide, please, Sarah. So this is an important part of the proposed changes. Talk us through what this means and what the knock-on effect, from what we know at the moment, is going to be for letting agents and landlords.
Right. So there's actually a very good summary of what the decent home standards are on the Goodlord Newsagent website. So I recommend everybody goes to that and has a look through.
I promise no Goodlord plugs, Sean. You've gone ahead, but indeed, whilst you've said it, I will allow it, of course. Please, and just on that point, please utilise that information. It's not about being a Goodlord customer. We try and put content out there that you can take, whether you're one of our customers or not. And I think we hope anyway that it helps have those conversations. But talk us through, for those who haven't read the Goodlord Newsagent site, talk us through what this means.
Okay, so effectively, what they want is some properties that comply with the legal minimum standards, which are kind of defined by the 29 hazards that are outlined in the the Housing Health and Safety rating system, which they have been reviewing and trying to simplify or trying to make a lot more user friendly. It also is going to mean that a tenant has the right to the property to be kept in good repair. The tenant has the right for the property to be relatively modern and with appropriate facilities. Funnily enough, that now will include things like Wi-Fi and other things there that are becoming more and more everyday life, not just the health and safety side of it. And of course, a commitment to a reasonable thermal, a warm home, basically. warm or temperature controlled home. So those are the sort of areas. So there's 29 hazards that an enforcement agency can currently enforce on. If you get over 1,000, you're in big trouble. And orders can be done by local authorities to improvement orders and repair orders can be issued. But that's a kind of framework. In my mind, that's a good starting point. But we have a very diverse sector, and it's going to be quite difficult in how you gauge a lot of these things there, especially for older properties and properties of non-standard build and other stuff there. So a lot of work has got to go into that, so that you are enshrining those issues, but you are not prohibiting huge amounts of the property from actually going onto the market. When Scotland looked at the EPC levels and they wanted to go straight to a C, they discovered that it would take out 60% of the private rented properties because of the construction of those buildings. So that's where I see us going. To me, I think it needs to be tied in with the redress. So I think because who's going to inspect all these properties, who's going to enforce these, tenants should have the right to raise these issues and have somebody arbitrate or mediate on them prior to it to going to enforcement. Otherwise, you will just have the system clogged up. I think in terms of inspections, the people who are best placed to do that, in my view, inventory clerks. Why not make inventories mandatory? Why are inventories not mandatory? That's the question.
I would agree, and I think the challenge this presents for agents, and maybe agents are being super picky at the moment as it is. But the challenge is that you are potentially going to be going out to properties that don't meet these standards. And actually, the first conversation having with the landlord is, this isn't up to scratch and you have to do this, and this to get in the market. That's going to feel like a weird conversation, isn't it? In a market that normally is primed to say, yes, let me take your property, and because of this, we'll rate it. The rental amount is this; it's slightly below market value, but I think we can find a tenant. There's going to be more accountability, I imagine, unintentionally maybe through the decent home standards on letting agents, because simply they're not going to want to hold stock on their property, or indeed landlords who don't want to be accountable to these kind of things on their books, because that is going to cause them problems. And we talked yesterday, Sean, about how this actually gets financed. So if repairs needed to be made or changes had to be made to the property, who does that? And you talked through one of your fears being that there could be some level of accountability on the agency themselves. Can you just talk us through that point? Because that, I think, should be something that agents are switched on to and potentially concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, from the get-go, when I started looking at this several years back, I was always going to say that the important thing was how this was going to meld in with the agency side, which is although Roper's not here, is relatively controlled and regulated through things like the Property Redress Scheme and other things there, and does have a high level of competence and expertise, especially when those agents have been through a Property Mark or a UCALA or a Safe Agent type training. So we know that agents are going to be key to this. We know that a lot of people go into the property world for investments, and they want to be hands-off. They want to be absent landlords or accidental landlords. So, of course, they rely on their agents. And, of course, the agent, if they are the, upfront and person that the tenant talks to, they're the ones that they're going to be approached. Of course, if they're going to turn around and say, well, no, we don't have the power to do this because of X, Y, or Z, that's going to cause a big issue. So I think it's going to be a big challenge how you tie redress for landlords and agents together, how you make sure that the tenant is protected, especially on things like the right to repair and the decent home standard, where an agent can only be responsible for the delivery of the service and not for the actual responsibilities. Who pays for that? Will an agent have to go to their landlords and say, oh, well, under the Tenants Fees Act, we can't charge the tenants anything at this stage. We have taken a deposit. We can't touch that until the end of the tenancy. But ongoing, we need to ensure that the standards are met. Please, could you deposit X of thousands of pounds into our account so that we can we can get the repairs done for you without you worrying about it. It's going to be quite a lot of that kind of thinking, because an agent is certainly not going to take the rap for the landlord's responsibility.
No.
If even if they are delegated to deal with them with their redress requirements.
And potentially sees a change in contractual clauses as well in relationships between landlords and agents to that effect. So if holding £2,000-3,000 in an account for that purpose isn't viable for landlord, then the agent's going to want to make sure that contractually, if they're carrying out works or looking to undertake and assess any works, that contractually they're provided for through the terms of business they have with the landlord, because otherwise it could get quite messy, couldn't it? And the worst case scenario there, I suppose, is a landlord saying, I'm not doing that work, I'm just simply not doing it. The agent then has to make a choice of what do they do? How implicated are they in that process, if indeed this standard comes through to fruition in the way that we think it will. So one to watch for the future, definitely. The devil will be in the detail on this from an agent and landlord perspective, won't it?
No, absolutely. And, that's going to be hugely, that relationship is going to be hugely important to the success of this.
One question from Vanessa here. Would you suggest using a checklist when viewing potential properties with potential landlords to safeguard the agent moving forwards? I see absolutely reason why you wouldn't do that. And a good form of education as well. I think we've got to remember, this again is the role that letting agents play. Most landlords will be oblivious to these changes. In fact, I wonder how many landlords are even aware of the Tenant Fee Act, which went ahead in June 2019. The role here is to educate and support, and it doesn't necessarily mean they like what they're going to hear, but indeed it does mean they're aware and they can make informed choices, because this isn't something to be played out. And as I said earlier, landlords are soon going to feel the brunt of this. If the legislation comes through in the manner it could, they're going to be as accountable as anybody else, if not more so. So I think certainly going around a property with a checklist in that manner, taking landlords through the potential changes, and to that point, your existing clientele, warming them up through these changes. When we get more detail coming down the tracks, messaging and communicating with your existing base of landlords, so this doesn't feel like a clean shock. Because again, we're hoping there are more powers involved in this that help landlords, but they're going to want to get educated on this. And we can certainly support with content should you want anything from Goodlord. Again, visit our Newsagent site, as Sean put it out earlier. One of the things that's been missing off the list, a bit like Arsenal in the Champions League, Sean, is lifetime deposits. This was actually, as per our understanding, a year or two ago, front and centre. This was going to be an important part of the Renters Reform Bill. We're aware the government had utilised PwC to go and look at third parties. To your point earlier, they don't want to manage this thing themselves. They want to find third-party avenues that can support this. But this does seem to have gone extremely quiet. Again, a bit like the Arsenal fans at the Emirates, Sean. I'll double down on the joke. I'm feeling potentially very, very happy after the weekend's football. But it's gone quiet, hasn't it? And should we expect to hear any news about regarding this over the next few months, or do you think this is something that's been put on the curb because it's just too tricky to solve?
I think it's partly the latter. I think that it's a work in progress. I don't think they've 100% abandoned that and reform of the deposit process. But of course, they've now seen the reality. They've talked to the insurers. They've talked to the deposit schemes. They've talked to the people that actually know how this all works. And it's not as simple as they think it is. So what I envisage is that work will continue to go on with that. I very much want to see end of tenancy redress for all tenants. So the no deposit schemes and the deposit schemes and all the other things that are out there, the tenants should still have access to a redress at the end of that process, which I think landlord redress will be able to accommodate. I think that certainly there will be innovations from various people on putting solutions that are partially or a solution to this, because we are looking at possibly loans, we are looking at possibly insurance on this, and these are not simple things to do. And whether you can get a universal process that protects everybody the same is the big challenge. And if you would say, well, actually, some of the schemes or ideas are applicable only to the people that don't need them in the first place necessarily. How do you protect the more vulnerable tenant who may be struggling to find a temporary to deposit situation, or or needs a bit more help and support when they would be low down in an insurance or a loan scenario type product.
And indeed, it's convincing landlords as well. That's what we've seen in this side of the sector over the last sort of 4 or 5 years. It's all right having some kind of other option, but if landlords aren't on board with it or they don't understand it, ultimately they're reverting to type. And you've got a big question around what happens with existing deposits versus the new deposit process. If the new deposit process, how does that work if you're moving up, significant rent increase, for example, from one property to another, but you've got damages in the previous property arrears. The amount of permutations here were frankly clear from the start. This is a tricky thing to master. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes. And to that point, the white paper, you think, you hope, given what they'd said, you're holding them accountable here. You said June the 21st. Just talk us through why you said June the 21st, Sean.
Well, I spoke to when I got a briefing after the Queen's speech. Very good. The civil servants got a list of people they ring round, and they said, "Look, it's not going to come out in May." They said there. And I said, "Well, you did promise spring." And they said, "Well, yeah, we've got until the 21st of June. That's when spring officially ends." So, I mean, that's the next deadline. I mean, look, the likelihood is, and this is tongue in cheek, it's probably going to be announced on the Friday at 5 o'clock, just before Thursday, isn't it? Before we go into the Queen's birthday weekend, isn't it? It's Thursday now, isn't it? So, watch out on that. I'll be watching on tenterhooks to see if that just drops in my inbox, just literally before we're all off on to celebrate Her Majesty's birthday. Yeah.
Joking aside, June 21st is not far away, and for those of you who have watched today and listened to it sort of ramble through this, there's a reason why we're kind of rambling in some respects, because it's detail light, and we're trying to make sense of the tidbits we've been given. They've got a lot of work to do between now and June the 21st. If all these points, and there's much more, including the rent reform bill than just we've noted here, if all these points are going to be covered to a point that actually gives certainty, haven't they? So, I question how clear we're going to feel following the paper. Sorry, I don't know. Maybe I've got this wrong. I hope I have, but it was a long way.
I mean, the reality is, a white paper itself is not a finished article. It's not an oven-ready bill.
Sure.
It is basically an outline of what they intend to include in this bill, and there will be a consultation process following that. Another consultation process, I know, but this means that that when it goes into the formal adoption of the bill through Parliament, which there would be less contention. That's what they're hoping. There could be more contention, of course, but this is going to be a slowish kind of process. Now that even if it starts on the 21st of June, we are still not looking at legislation by the end of the year. I would say certain things may be able to be put into place. But have a look at the what's been going on with the fire safety bill. They haven't even got a final published version of that out yet, and they're going to rely on what's called statutory instruments. And the last time I heard, it was going to be over 125 statutory instruments just to implement what's in that bill. This bill is not going to be as complex, but it will certainly need an awful lot of work. I expect a lot of delegated powers to be included. So I don't know if you remember the story on client money protection. After all the years of lobbying for that, we eventually got an amendment into law, which empowered the Secretary of State to at a further date implement this. In terms of that, where I think regulation will probably go, and the ROPA will go, and also the lifetime deposits, they will be put in so that the minister's empowered to look at it in a future day. But you have to remember that in 2009, when they brought out the Estate Agency Act, they put a provision in for regulation of estate agents, which has still not been looked at.
So with that in mind, then, sorry, I'm conscious we've got a minute or two left tops. that takes our timeline into 20. In answer to Karen's for the question there in the chat around, when do we think this gets delivered? Do you think we're looking at 2024? Unknown at the moment. Kind of, we will have to wait through the paper then to make a form. I don't recognise there is a clear timeline on this of when this will be delivered in totality.
It's going to be a mixture. I think the reality is that the government has to have been shown to deliver something before an election.
Before the election, yeah.
So and that's why I think Section 21 will all but name go. Even if that is as simple as amending the current forms to include a reason. So that I definitely think will be delivered before the election, and possibly the register. And they will need to tender out the redress or set that up, because that's not going to be a quick process. All of these things, if they're going to go out into to tender, has to go through their commercial department, and that is regulated by a whole host of regulations in terms of how government can procure services. So there's no quick fix for that. So it's not a matter of just coming and saying, "Oh, fancy doing that next week," and setting that up. So that's going to take some while. So you're right. A lot of it will probably have to go into the next manifesto pledge for after the next election. So but definitely I think they will be looking to deliver Section 21 before the election. That's my bet.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Again, it's that point of saying, look, we've delivered something. We followed through on what we said we were going to do. We've got a few questions to cover, which I'll try and do as quickly as we can. So we've got one from where is Russell here? Russell, hi. What happens if a tenant refuses to renew a tenancy and landlord does not want contracts gone periodic and risk property coming available at a quieter time of year, i.e. December? So essentially, question here: tenant. I'm just trying to make sure I've got that right. The tenant refuses to renew the tenancy. Now, I imagine I suppose it depends on the tenancy itself, doesn't it, Sean? Because if the original agreement allows for it to go on periodic, which it normally would, then ultimately the landlord can't enforce a renewal of contract as part of that. They can, though, then at this moment in time, take the view of a Section 21 to get the property back, I'd imagine. Yeah,
no, that's absolutely how it stands at the moment. So yes, you could put in put in contractual clauses for notice periods, and giving the landlord an intent of what you need to do after that. But of course, if it gets to the end of the fixed term, they roll into statutory periodic, and there's nothing you can really do about that other than communicate with the tenant and put your points of what you actually want to do. And ultimately, at the moment you could take the Section 21. So it's something that they will have to consider. That what would you do if you have a tenant that that doesn't want to commit to a fixed term? So
and that's there's a knock-on
question
there. There's a knock-on question there from that to Ben, who says, so will new tenancy agreements do away with periodic tenancies when Section 21 is gone? I don't think that's the suggestion at all, actually. From what I've seen, although the device in which you can manage the situation that we've just described of clearly changes the moment Section 21 isn't applicable.
No, absolutely. And the government, and again, I don't think this has gone entirely away. They are also committed to longer tenancies. They want to see a standard longer tenancy in place. And how then the rolling tenancy will pan out in that. There are attractions to both sides for a rolling tenancy. There are disadvantages for both sides of the rolling tenancy. So we will see. Again, if you're getting rid of Section 21, are you really kind of like having to, like what they're doing in Wales, look at the whole of the tenancy? They've done it in Wales and Scotland. Do we go that far, or do you just amend or tinker with what you've already got?
And a question from David. I'm a landlord. An experienced solicitor advised me the best way to deal with a toxic tenant is to dump them out of the property and let them chase me through the courts. Thoughts? I'm pretty confident in saying absolutely do not do that. You clearly can't condone sort of bypassing any kind of law or regulation or legislation. I'm sure, Sean, you mirror the thoughts on that. You can't see just tenants out on the street.
I always worry, sorry to the question there, I always worry when I have spoken to an experienced lawyer and you hear something like that. You do have to kind of worry about that. What I would say is that if you have a situation, mediation and early intervention can actually be very, very effective for this.
Indeed, we utilise that as part of our rent protection insurance product, and it's been really effective in educating tenants, especially to understand, one, there could be other means in which to get out of the situation they're in, but two, to understand the situation they are in. I don't think most tenants understand that by not paying their rent, it could have serious implications moving on for the next 6 odd years, especially if a money order is obtained at the end of that and it goes on their credit file. So, no, I mean, communication, I think, is always the number one priority. Please do not follow that person's advice in terms of essentially dumping them out of the property and not following the proper recourse. It will not end well invariably. And final point, Eric Walker's popped up again to say, should we not take comfort from the Scotland changes a few years ago, which Westminster seemed to be mirroring, and which, after the same concern, all turned out to be fine in the end? It's relatively optimistic for Eric. It must be. It's only 11 o'clock, I suppose. We've got a few hours to go in the day yet.
I saw a marvellous quote the other day, and knowing Eric so well, it's part of his philosophy. He says, hope is optimism with a plan. So the question is now that we can be hopeful, because this does start to look more of a plan than it did ever before. We are not there yet. And if we are to be optimistic, that plan needs to be a blueprint which we can all buy into. But yes, I know we should be optimistic because it's a good industry at the moment, and a lot of this will actually tidy up some of the anomalies that have been out there in legislative framework and make it stronger for us. The government at least has listened to the people that actually know what they're talking about in this case. They need to be commended for that. However, politics being politics, populism being populism, we have to keep them, their noses to the grindstone to deliver this in an effective way.
I think that's exactly it, and it's a great way to end today's webinar. I think understanding the detail as much as is available at the moment is what we're trying to do on this kind of call, and we'll continue to have these sessions as and when more information comes out to try and share that and sort of talk through the opinion piece as well, because clearly from the top of the webinar, all the way through, the tone is that this is a concern, that landlords are concerned at the moment regarding other factors. Is this the straw that breaks the camel's back almost? And I think that the takeaway is that no, I think there should be a view here that this is kind of leveling out some of the inconsistencies in a process that, let's all be honest, isn't perfect. I know change is difficult, but the process isn't perfect at the moment. But I think, like you finished with there, Sean, our role collectively is to make sure that the powers that be are held accountable to deliver changes that make sense, rather than based on something that maybe is a vote winner. So with that end, thank you so much to the hundreds of letting agents and participants that have joined today. We very much appreciate your time. If you've got any further questions, if I've missed any questions, I do apologise. This session was designed to be 30 to 45 minutes. We've gone over an hour. So lesson there to bill a bit more time, Sean. And indeed, if there's anything we can help with, either be it through Sean's capacity or indeed Goodlord's capacity, then we're both on hand to help. And we hope to see you again on another webinar. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you very much, Ollie.
Cheers now. Bye-bye.